Okay, so influence decoders, if you were with us for that last deep dive, brainworms, inception, and idea seeding, you remember we were really getting into how ideas kind of get stuck in our heads.
Yeah, that was a fun one.
Yeah, it really was. But we're building on that today because, like, what happens after an idea, finds its way to our minds? How does it spread,
Mhm.
person to person across, like, the whole digital world? How does it end up shaping, like, the beliefs that we all share,
Yeah.
that really kind of influence the world around us? I think that's what we're really going to unpack today.
Yeah, yeah, totally. We're shifting from like that individual level, like you said, to that collective level, right? And examining how those initial like sparks of an idea turn into these like widespread, like almost wildfires online, especially now in this like crazy digital age. And we have some really great sources that you, the listeners, sent to us. They cover a really wide range of things from like the inner workings of these digital platforms that we're talking about to the complexities of like human psychology and even like, how we even define belief itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got contagious beliefs,
Yeah.
digital tech and psychological influence,
Mhm.
digital belief dynamics and mitigation, digital belief dynamics, synthesis and future directions, digital minds, technology, psychology, and belief systems, the digital ecology of beliefs and network narratives, and then some like more kind of big picture stuff with the power of belief, thought forms and shared realities, and the power of shared beliefs, manifestation and influence. That's a lot, I know. But don't worry, influence decoders, we're going to like pull out the most important stuff for you.
Yeah, for sure. And the really valuable thing for you as a listener is like you'll walk away with a much clearer idea of how certain ideas kind of take off online. Like, why do some things go viral? We'll give you the tools to like be a smarter consumer of information online, and to better navigate the craziness of like online discussions, which can get pretty heated, right?
Right, totally.
So it's like your shortcut to being really well informed,
Hmm.
having those aha moments without getting like totally bogged down with information overload.
Exactly. So our mission today is pretty clear. We're going to unpack the basic mechanics of how these digital beliefs spread. We'll explore like the dance between, technology and our own psychology.
Yeah.
And we'll even touch on like how we can navigate this whole thing, all based on like, the sources you gave us. So let's dive in. This is a huge topic though, so where do we even start? I mean, it's got to be the tech itself, right? Digital tech has to play a huge role in like amplifying these beliefs.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, look at platforms like Facebook, X, TikTok. Their whole reason for being, right, their
Mhm.
business model is about keeping people, scrolling, clicking, engaged. And the algorithms that used to do that are like ridiculously sophisticated.
Yeah, I mean, you can really see it, right? Like, spend a little too long watching cat videos. Suddenly, your whole feed is kittens.
Right. Exactly. And the interesting thing is how often that push for engagement, what keeps us on these platforms favors content that's really emotionally charged.
Oh, that's so true. Content that makes you mad,
Yeah.
scared, super happy, it just grabs you. And our sources, they point out there's a reason for that, like a deep psychological reason. We're wired to remember and share stuff that, like, hits us in the feels.
Exactly. The contagious belief source, remember that one? It had that great example of COVID-19 misinformation, claims that vaccines were changing people's DNA or whatever, all that stuff, driven by fear. That generated way more engagement than, just straightforward public health info.
Right. It's like the scarier it is, the more people share it, which, like, does make sense if you think about it. But
But that's our brains on social media, right?
yeah.
And that emotional charge, whether it's accurate or not, makes it stick. Then you add in that whole algorithmic thing, like you said, the echo chambers and filter bubbles. It's like they learn what we already think and then they just feed us more of the same.
Yeah, it's a loop, right? You get more of what you click on, so you end up in this little bubble where everyone agrees.
And that just reinforces confirmation bias, that tendency to look for information that matches what we already believe. So the algorithms give us that, and boom, we're even more sure we're right. And then you get group polarization, where everyone in these online groups just becomes more and more extreme because they're only talking to each other.
Oh, like QAnon. That's a perfect example, right? It started in these like weird little corners online, and then, those algorithms kind of pushed it out into the mainstream.
Right. And it shows just how powerful these online spaces are, even for ideas that most people would find like out there. And then there's the speed, the sheer speed of how things go viral online. Like something can be all over the world in minutes. That's crazy.
It's like the internet's this giant network of like instant connections, right?
Yeah.
And that means those like fringe ideas, they can jump between all these different groups in ways we never saw before.
Totally. And then there's the whole concept of like memes. They're everywhere online and they're designed to be shared, right? Simple, repetitive, catchy.
Yeah, and they often have a visual element too, like a picture or a video, which makes them even stickier.
Exactly. And it goes back to that idea of cognitive ease. Our brains love things that are easy to process, and we often mistake that ease for truth. So a meme, with its simplicity, repetition, it just feels right, even if it's totally bogus. Like, remember that GameStop thing?
Oh yeah, with Reddit, Wall Street bets,
Yeah.
that was wild. It was like a meme-powered movement
Yeah.
driving up the stock price. They had all this jargon like to the moon.
Exactly. And it shows that these digital tools can be used for like really rapid coordination on a huge scale, even if the goal seems like totally irrational to people outside the group.
It's like the tech gives you the tools, but then it's like human psychology that makes it all work, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what is it about us, like psychologically, that makes us so susceptible to these like contagious beliefs online? What's the driver there?
Well, one of the biggest things is this thing called emotional contagion, right? The idea that content that triggers strong emotions like anger, fear, excitement, those things spread like wildfire.
Oh yeah, totally. It's like if it makes you react, you're going to share it, whether it's true or not, almost.
Almost. And there's a neurological basis for this. When we experience those like high arousal emotions, our brain releases dopamine and that makes us feel good, right?
Mhm.
So we're drawn back to that content, to those platforms, and we engage more. It's a cycle.
Oh, that's so interesting. Like the more worked up you get, the more you want to go back for more.
It can be like that, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, think about those anti-vaccine narratives online. You see those really intense personal stories, really disturbing images, and they totally bypass your logical thinking and go straight for your gut reaction.
Ah, yeah. It's hard to look away from that stuff, even if you know it's probably not the whole story.
Right. And that makes those narratives super shareable, even if they're not accurate.
Hmm.
And then there's our natural tendency to like look to others for clues on what to believe, social proofs and authority bias.
Oh, yeah. Like if everyone's saying it, it must be true.
All right.
Or if someone we see as like an expert says it, we're more likely to believe it.
Exactly. And that opens up a whole can of worms when it comes to manipulation online, like with astroturfing, where it looks like there's this huge consensus, but it's all manufactured.
Yeah, it's fake popularity, basically,
Well,
designed to make you think everyone agrees.
right. And the scary thing is how easy it is to fake that online. Remember those Russian troll farms during the 2016 election? Fake accounts designed to look like real people, pushing specific narratives. It was a whole operation.
Wow. That's wild. And then there's the whole thing with, like, stories. We love a good story.
We do, we do. And our brains kind of prefer a simple, clear story, even if it's not totally true, over something that's complicated and messy. And so much online content is structured in these like short, sensational bursts.
Oh, it's true. Like, even the news is often presented in, like, these bite-sized chunks, right?
Yeah.
With, like, catchy headlines.
Exactly. Our brains crave those patterns, that sense of narrative, and the platforms reward content that fits into our existing beliefs, the way we already see the world.
So it's like they're not just giving us information, they're shaping how we think about it, too.
Yeah. It's kind of like the medium is the message, right?
Right, right. And then there's the whole thing with, like, rewards, those little dopamine hits we get from social media.
Oh, yeah, those notifications, the likes, the shares, that's all designed to keep us hooked.
It's like a little gambling machine in our pocket, right? You never know when you're going to win.
Exactly. And that keeps us checking, scrolling, engaging, which means we're exposed to more of this, belief spreading content, whether we realize it or not.
And then you've got the whole world of influencers and like how we relate to
Oh,
them.
that's a big one. The parasocial relationships, we feel like we know these people even though we've never met them.
Right. Like they're our friends, even if they're just like on a screen.
Exactly. And that can really amplify that whole authority bias thing. We're more likely to trust what they say, even if it's not true.
So it's like all these different factors, they kind of work together
Right.
to make these beliefs more contagious. It's not just one thing, it's a combination.
Yeah, and when you put it all together, you start to see these like feedback loops of radicalization. The algorithms push us to more and more extreme content, and then we have this psychological thing called dissonance reduction.
Oh, yeah. Like once you've kind of bought into something, it's hard to change your mind, even if there's evidence that you're wrong.
Totally. It's like we double down on our beliefs, to justify the fact that we already like invested in them
Hmm.
emotionally, It's really hard to admit you're wrong, especially when it feels like your whole identity is tied up in something. And there's that awful example of the riots in Sri Lanka back in 2018.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that. It was all fueled by rumors and fake news spreading on Facebook.
Right. It escalated so quickly. And then there were those online spaces that are just made for like creating and spreading these kinds of narratives, like 4chan.
Oh, yeah, 4chan. That's where, like, a lot of internet memes come from, right?
Yeah, but it's also a place where people can like anonymously build these elaborate narratives that because everyone's agreeing and validating each other, they start to feel real, even if they're totally made up.
It's like the internet version of campfire stories, but with potentially much bigger consequences.
Yeah, and the example of the Stormwind fallacy in gaming culture, it shows how this kind of collaborative storytelling, even when it's not meant to be harmful, can end up shaping people's beliefs about the game.
So when you step back and look at the big picture, you start to see, like, the blueprint of how beliefs go viral, right?
Yeah.
There are certain things that make them more likely to spread.
Totally. And one of the biggest ones, especially in conspiracy theories, is this thing called unfalsifiability. It's like a built-in defense mechanism.
Oh, like, no matter what evidence you present, it's just proof that the conspiracy is even deeper than you thought.
Exactly. Like with QAnon, they'd say the plan changed whenever something didn't happen as predicted. It's a way to protect the core belief no matter what.
So you can never really prove them wrong.
Right. And then you've got this thing called identity fusion. It's where our beliefs become so tied up with who we see ourselves as.
Yeah, like, it's not just what I think, it's who I am.
Right. And those online communities, they really reinforce that, especially on platforms like Reddit or Telegram, where people can find others who share their beliefs no matter how niche they are.
It's like the internet gives you the space to be your truest self, which can be great, but it also means you might end up surrounded by people who all agree with you, even when you're wrong.
It's tricky, for sure. And then you've got information cascades. That's where it looks like everyone agrees, even if the original claim was bogus.
Like that Pizzagate thing.
Exactly. That spread so fast, just through repetition, people saw it everywhere and assumed it must be true, even though there was no evidence. And now we've got this whole new layer of complexity with AI-generated content. Things like GPT-4 can pump out tons of incredibly persuasive stuff, and it's hard to tell what's real.
Yeah, it's getting harder and harder to know what to believe.
Totally. And then there are deepfakes. They're getting so good, they can make anyone look like they're saying or doing anything. It's scary, because we used to rely on visuals as proof.
Yeah, like a picture was worth 1,000 words. But
Yeah.
now, you can't even trust that anymore. And you were talking about augmented reality before. That's still kind of mind-blowing to me.
It's getting real, though. Think about it. People walking around with AR glasses, seeing different digital layers on top of the actual world. You could have people living in totally different realities based on what their AR is showing them. Imagine climate activists seeing all these stats on pollution and deniers seeing nothing. Just a beautiful landscape.
Oh, wow, that's like next-level division, right?
Right. It's not just online anymore. It's like bleeding into the real world.
Mm.
And then there's this thing called cross-platform belief migration. It's where these fringe ideas that start in these like obscure corners online, they find their way into the mainstream.
So it's like they're sneaking in through the back door, using memes and influencers to make them seem more acceptable.
Exactly. The Boogaloo movement is a good example. It started on these niche forums, and then it spread through memes on TikTok and Instagram. It's scary how these things can jump platforms.
It's like they evolved to survive in the digital ecosystem.
Totally. And it's important to remember that all this stuff we're talking about online, it's not just theoretical. It has real-world consequences.
Oh, absolutely. Like those financial bubbles you mentioned earlier with Tulip Mania and Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
Those were driven by, like, collective belief, right? Mass psychology.
Yeah, people got caught up in the hype, believing that things would keep going up forever. And then you've got urban legends that can lead to real harm. Like the Slender Man case, where those girls attacked their friend because they believed in this online myth.
That's a horrifying reminder that what we believe can have a real impact, even if it starts online.
Absolutely. And then, of course, you've got political movements. Beliefs are at the heart of those, whether it's a movement for good or, something more harmful.
Right, like shared beliefs can bring people together for change, but they can also be used to manipulate and control. It's powerful stuff.
It is. And when you think about the whole ecosystem of these digital beliefs, it's like these algorithms and our own psychology, they're creating these self-reinforcing environments.
It's like a digital echo chamber, right? Where the more time you spend online, the more entrenched you become in these specific ways of thinking.
Yeah, and one of the sources called it digital neuroplasticity, which is kind of a fancy way of saying that our brains are being shaped by the digital world, you know? It's like our brains are adapting to this constant flow of information, and it can be hard to break out of those patterns.
So it's like the algorithms are not just showing us content, they're actually rewiring our brains.
It's possible.
Yep.
And then you've got this idea of mimetic selection pressure. It's like certain beliefs are just better adapted to survive and spread in the digital world. You know, like with the flat earth theory, it's got this simple explanation, this strong sense of community among believers, and it just keeps going.
It's like, even though it's totally wrong, it's got all the right ingredients to go viral.
Exactly. And we need to remember those network effects too. It's not just about what individuals believe, it's about how those beliefs spread through networks.
So it's like if enough people believe something, it almost takes on a life of its own, regardless of whether it's true.
Right. And there's this concept of threshold effects, where a belief might stay kind of contained within a small group until it hits a tipping point, and then it explodes outward. Like the Stop the Steal movement. It went from these fringe online spaces to the mainstream, and it played a role in what happened on January 6th.
That's a scary example of how these things can escalate, right? From
Yeah.
online chatter to real-world consequence.
It is. And then there's this thing called narrative synchronization, where multiple sources, even if they're not working together, they're all pushing the same narrative.
So it creates this illusion of consensus, like everyone agrees, even they don't.
Exactly. Like with COVID-19 early on, there was a lot of uncertainty, legitimate debate among scientists. But if different sources are all highlighting the same concerns, even if they're not the whole picture, it can be used to create distrust.
Like they're cherry-picking information to fit a certain narrative.
Right. And one of the sources suggested that we need more transparency, especially in science. Like, be clear that knowledge is always evolving, that new data can change things.
So it's not about suppressing different viewpoints. It's about being open about the process of how we arrive at knowledge.
Exactly. And the Digital Mind source really digs into how those algorithms work. It's not just that they prioritize engagement, it's that they're actively shaping our preferences.
So it's like they're not just showing us what we want, they're figuring out what we'll respond to and giving us more of that.
Yeah. They're collecting all this data on us, figuring out our emotional triggers, and then using that to personalize the content we see.
It's like they're playing us, like a giant psychological experiment.
It can feel like that, right? And that source even compared social media to gambling machines.
Oh, yeah, with those unpredictable rewards, the likes and notifications, like you get that little dopamine hit and you keep coming back for more.
Exactly. And then there's this thing called prediction immunization, which is how people deal with when their beliefs are challenged.
So it's like instead of changing their minds when something they predicted doesn't happen, they just come up with new explanations to fit their existing beliefs.
Right. It's a way to protect their worldview. And the order in which we encounter information matters too. Like, if you see a certain claim early on, it can really stick with you, even if you later see evidence that contradicts it.
So it's like first impressions really matter, even online.
They do. And all of this, it raises some pretty serious questions, you know, about ethics, about society.
Absolutely. Like if we can't agree on basic facts, if we're all living in our own little echo chambers, how can we function as a society?
Right. And the whole thing with micro-targeting and deepfakes, that's a real threat to democracy. If you can target individuals with custom-made disinformation, it undermines the whole idea of informed choice.
It's like instead of having a public debate, we're having these like millions of private conversations, each tailored to manipulate the individual.
It's a bit Orwellian, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we can't forget about the impact on mental health. All this negativity and division online, it takes a toll, especially on young people.
It's hard to escape it.
It is. And then there are the ethical questions, you know, about manipulation, about free will. Like, how much agency do we really have in forming our beliefs in this environment?
It's a big question, right? Like, are we really in control of our own minds? Or are we being subtly influenced in ways we don't even realize?
Yeah, it's not an easy one to answer. But the good news is the research also points to some potential solutions, some ways to fight back against all of this.
Okay, so as influence decoders, what can we do? What are the tools we can use to navigate all of this?
Well, one of the most promising ideas is this thing called cognitive inoculation. It's like building up your mental immunity to misinformation.
So it's like a vaccine for your mind.
Exactly. You get exposed to weakened versions of these misinformation tactics, you learn how to spot them, and it makes you more resistant. There are some really cool projects working on this, like Google's Jigsaw initiative and this game called Bad News.
Oh, I've heard of that game. It's like you play as a fake news creator, right? So you learn all the tricks.
Exactly. And it's surprisingly effective. And it's also important to emphasize the positive social norms around accuracy and critical thinking.
So it's like making it cool to be smart and well-informed.
Right. Like with the hashtag #ScienceUpFirst campaign, it's about making it clear that most people do value truth and reason.
It's like pushing back against the idea that everyone's just buying into whatever they see online.
Exactly. And even small changes to the way platforms are designed can help. Things like prompting people to read an article before they share it.
Oh, that's interesting. Just to slow down that impulse to share, make people think for a second.
Right. And then there's this idea of precision targeting, where instead of trying to debunk everything everywhere, you focus on the biggest spreaders of misinformation.
So it's like finding those key influencers who are really driving the spread of these beliefs.
Exactly. And those people who act as bridges between different communities, if you can target those key nodes, you can have a bigger impact. And there are just-in-time interventions where you try to debunk misinformation before it even spreads.
So it's like getting ahead of the curve, anticipating what people might fall for.
Right. Like in Ukraine in 2022, they knew Russia was going to spread disinformation about biolabs, so they got out in front of it with their own evidence. And it's often more effective to offer a better story, a more compelling alternative narrative, than just to debunk something.
So it's not just about saying, this is wrong. It's about giving people a better way to understand the world, a story they can connect with.
Exactly. And crucially, it's about teaching people the skills to think critically, to evaluate sources for themselves. That's more powerful than censorship.
Yeah, it's about empowering people to be their own fact checkers.
Right. And there's also work being done on fostering dialogue between people with different beliefs.
Like creating spaces where people can actually talk to each other instead of just yelling at each other online.
Exactly. Organizations like Braver Angels are doing great work on that. It's about finding common ground, remembering that we're all human.
It's a reminder that we have more in common than we might think. And looking ahead, we have to figure out how to deal with AI. That feels like a whole other level of challenge.
It is. We need ways to like watermark AI generated content so we know what's real. And we have to think about AR and how it could create these separate realities.
That's like we're building a whole new world, and we need to make sure it's one where truth and critical thinking still matter.
Absolutely. And all of this is happening globally, so we need solutions that work across different cultures.
It's a huge task, but we got to start somewhere.
We do. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that beliefs are powerful. They can do amazing things, but they can also be incredibly destructive. And the internet has just amplified that power.
It's like the internet is this incredible tool, but it can also be a weapon, depending on how it's used.
It's true. And as influence decoders, we're all in this together. We have to be aware of how these forces are working, how our own minds are being shaped by the digital world. So be mindful of what you're consuming online, think critically, and don't be afraid to challenge your own beliefs.
Great advice. So, influence decoders, what really stood out for you in this deep dive? What are you most curious about? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and follow the podcast for more explorations like this.
Your insights are what keep this going, so keep those questions coming.
Absolutely. Until next time, stay curious and keep decoding those influences.